Welcome to the latest episode of the Aurion Learning Leaders series. Today I'm joined by Alan Forsyth from British Telecom. Good day, Alan.
Hi there, how are you?
Doing well, doing well. Alan, we've got a series of set questions that we're asking everybody. But maybe we just start by asking you to maybe introduce yourself, what your current role is and what your journey in learning has been to date.
Certainly, and Gavin, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity firstly to come on and speak. It's really appreciated and quite a rare occurrence in my career to be able to do something like this. So yeah, my name's Alan Forsyth. I've been with BT since the year 2000 and 19 of those years have been spent in L&D. I'll briefly talk about my current role. I've been doing that in some guise now for the last 7 years, and that's to look after our sort of global ethics and compliance learning. That encompasses mandatory training, which is the stuff most organisations rely on as their corporate shield. So I'm responsible for all learning in this space, and it's a big responsibility that spans our teams right around the world. And it's something I haven't lost any passion for, as well as we try and continuously improve what we do in this space. Out with those 7 years, I started life as an e-learning designer, which has given me some really good skills, some really good tools to be able to identify whether I think, and remember learning can sometimes be very subjective, is whether I think something is of good quality. And for a number of those years as well, beyond the sort of e-learning designer phase, I was a training manager, also in BT as well. So I've had my share of ups and downs as well, but I've learned so much in that 19 years.
Okay. Well, you mentioned a few words already that are interesting on quality and innovation. So maybe with our first question, we could lead into that. What does learning that works mean for you?
Well, firstly, it's a brilliant question, and I wouldn't be alone in thinking that it probably means different things to different people, and it sometimes depends as well on the size of the organisation you work in, the countries you operate in, or general local geography as well. So, you might be limited in terms of what you can produce, but for me, I always believe that the learner is my number one customer. So anything that's produced, whether it be classroom, blended, online or e-learning, it should be built around them. It's got to be engaging, it's got to be situational, contextual, but most importantly, tell a great story. So I've seen many pieces of learning, for example, that are created based on a process, with no clear context. So learners have no idea what they need to do to put it into practice. It's more, we need more focus on real life than simple hypothesis. So if you're looking at building some kind of intervention based on a process, you need to know very clearly what types of things feed into that process. And you're only going to find that out by taking the time to ask the people who deal with it in the real world, what it actually looks like, and base it on experiences or potential future experiences. So that, for me, is the fundamental thing about what I think learning that works means, is focusing it on the learner and telling a great story.
Sure. And when we think maybe about the solutions, so assuming that, Alan, you've gone through that process of analysis and you've actually created something, so putting yourself in the shoes of the learner, what do you think makes a good learning experience? That's a word we hear a lot at the moment.
I guess for me, it's something that feels real. And I touched on it just very briefly with the previous question, and it's something that's not hypothetical. So in my experience, most learners only buy into learning if it's relevant and tailored to them. So much of it depends on the work that goes on prior to the end product, so the thing that reaches them. And it's the people you surround yourself as the creator that really makes the difference. So you need to do your needs analysis, you need to do good research, and you need to engage with the target audience and the stakeholders as well who have asked you to do it. And that's the only way you'll make something really good. as well, if it's too passive, people are going to switch off. And if there's too much reading, people won't absorb it. So you've got a really fine balance to strike. And then you've got the learners themselves. So there's some interesting statistic I read somewhere a few years ago that 40% of adults have self-taught themselves at some point. And that's anything from researching a new TV or a car, how-to videos on YouTube even, and anything that's situational and real. So, I mean, from my perspective, and you might disagree, but I believe, formal training programs, they've got a really limited success in increasing basic skills for individuals. Most individuals probably older than 25. So these individuals rely mostly on the job training. So if we switch that around and focus learning interventions probably to rely somewhat on experience and situation, people are going to be more likely to interact with it. And what really tops off that good learning experience is to do what you can do to keep it alive. So don't just rely on that once they've completed it, that's a tick in the box mentality. Follow it up, reach out a few weeks later or a few months later, find out if they've been able to put the learning into practice and did it help them. And then if it didn't, you've got some great insight to fine tune or make the experience better for next time.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with that. At Aurion, Alan, we would use an extend my learning approach. So very much, what do you want people to do? How can they extend the learning for those who need to do it, but also those who want to do it, which we sometimes forget about. Those people who actually want to learn a little bit more, find something of interest, are there opportunities? So I suppose it's touching on that, learning in the flow of work and continuous learning. So you're dealing, Alan, with a couple of meaty areas in ethics and compliance, if you don't mind me saying, and obviously doing that, across BT different territories. Perhaps you could share with us about a significant challenge that you've tackled with learning. I know you shared one with me before, and what were the results that you were able to get?
Yes, I'm going to share that exact same one on this, if that's okay. It's quite a long one, so if I'm going too much into detail, just stop me. But it's closer to home. It's the UK population that we were dealing with this, and as I mentioned earlier on, my role is to manage our compliance learning portfolio, and like I mentioned as well, it's for every employee right across the globe, but this one is closer to home. But it also means and crosses multiple layers of employees. So you've got your executive level right across to your sort of frontline team members. So in a contact center environment, it's easy to schedule training, as most learners are bunched together in locations. But for this particular one, it was for Openreach's engineer population. And this isn't the case because they tend to work quite siloed on their own, and they're on the road a lot as well. So historically, the only way that they could complete their compliance learning was to be scheduled out, have their travel time factored in, along with a return to an exchange to boot up the laptop and complete it. So this could happen potentially up to 5 times a year because they were assigned 5 courses. So if we sort of work that out, that's between 8 and 10 hours a year they'd spend completing their compliance learning that had been put in place for them. So we had 2 issues. The first was finding a way to reduce training and travel time so that engineers spent more time looking after their customers. And the second was about how we compress those 5 modules into one single tailored course that could also be completed on the go if they wanted to. So to put it very simply, it was about reducing training and travel time, and then just having that one course which covered off the fundamental risks that an engineer might face on the job. So believe it or not, the barrier for the first issue was particularly easy to overcome because, let's face it, who wouldn't want less training? But the first step with anything radical like this is to get the buy-in, the agreement and sponsorship of someone very senior in the business. So once you have that, it becomes easier to have those conversations with the other people in the business responsible for particular risks. So it's very important to map those risks as well, and simply put that what are, for an engineer, the top 10 to 20 risks that they might face in terms of compliance. And then it's a matter of weighting those risks in the training so that the focus is on the most common and or the most brand affecting. So for engineers, it can be anything from whether it's all right to accept a biscuit and a cup of tea, in a customer's home or premises to using their company vehicle for paid work on the days off. And each of these needs to be treated quite sensitively. And there's a big, massive behavioural element to this whole thing that we worked on as well. So that's the psychology of decision making. So everything tied together so that it answers and guides the learner on what doing the right thing looks like and should be. So this is the stage where we needed to engage with the learners that the training was aimed at. I think I touched on that on question 1. So at that point, it was about holding focus groups, asking questions, getting ideas from them and from their experiences doing the job. And then, what do they want from the training? They wanted it to be relevant and easy to follow. How do they want to do it? So they told us they want to do it on a mobile, but they may also do it on Exchange as well. What's important for them? So it was knowing what to do in certain situations. And that's sort of linked back to the behavioural stuff as well, because a lot of the compliance training that many organisations do, it's a blanket approach and just focuses more or less on the hypothetical. So we wanted to really make this tailored. So then it kind of allowed us as learning professionals to create what we called a learner profile. And that's what gives the best chance of this actually succeeding. So repeating what I said earlier, if the learning is relevant by telling a good story and it's tailored, your learners will buy into it. But the really hard part, learning should be memorable, right? So we accepted that challenge from the engineers themselves, and we built in a very simple hook. And that hook was ask yourself one simple question before doing something. And that question is it okay? So how that kind of manifested itself in the training was from very simple things like, is it okay to accept a cup of tea from a customer? Well, yes, it is. To something a little bit more vague, which is it okay to accept a packet of biscuits from a customer for a job well done? Well, no, it's not. There's a clear difference between the two. So this was the sort of big behavioural element, that holy grail of compliance training. So we continually invited engineers to help us refine it, fine-tune it, and make it better throughout the process. And that was anything from UX testing on multiple devices to just sense checking the scenarios. And as with most things like this, did we include a proof of learning? Well, the simple answer is yes, but we didn't stick a big quiz at the end. Instead, we asked questions throughout, and it wasn't your standard knowledge check questions either, but they were scenario driven, scenario based with a confidence dimension. So ultimately, this provided us with their level of confidence in the response. It's been so valuable in helping us determine if the learning landed, but most importantly, if there are pockets of people who could benefit from some additional training, embedding that continuous improvement model that you talked about a few seconds ago as well, Gavin, that many organisations used. And then you asked me, what were the results, I think?
Yes, it is, yeah.
So that was a very long-winded explanation. I do apologise in advance. But so with the is it okay question, the risk weighting, the contextual right and wrong scenarios, telling a good story, we were able to construct something, as you know, that won 2 awards last year. For me, though, while it was nice to win them, it was the feedback we got from our learners during the pilot phase, which was the big highlight for me. So we engaged with 800 of them. 800 engineers during the whole process. There's 20,000 plus of them in total. Out of those 800, 98% of them loved it and rated it 4.8 out of 5. And we got some really amazing feedback as well. Do you mind if I share just 3 snippets?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So the first one was just, I'm not going to put names to these, but these were verbatim. So well designed with clever questioning. Love that the course is set in real situations and uses everyday language. I really enjoyed it. It didn't feel like mandatory training at all, which for me was so pleasing because everybody, let's face it, hates doing mandatory or compliance training. So did we achieve that final outcome? Yes, we did. So we reduced training and travel time. We've now got one course that covers the fundamental risks that they could face on the job. And over that 12-month period, I'm nearly done, we've saved approximately 7 hours training time per engineer per year. So that equates to roughly £1.9 million, and it reduced the amount of travel time by 90%. So yeah, it's been a very satisfying project all round.
No, very good, very impressive. And anybody who deals with user feedback of all sorts, the variations that you can get to get people go out of their way for compliance training to give those sort of comments is obviously going to be very pleasing.
Absolutely, because out of those 800, we had 690 pieces of individual feedback as well.
Volume. I think volume speaks volumes at times. You're getting everybody saying something positive. Yeah, because I like your is it okay question, because we worked with a global sporting body, a sport close to my own heart in rugby, and one of the things I initially came, it was actually an anti-doping project, and I came to it initially thinking, we'll help, tell people about the consequences of doping, and we'll show them if they go down the wrong path, what could have been, they could have played for Scotland or Ireland. They wouldn't want to play for England, but they threw it all away, and their friend went on to greater things. But actually, they were saying that, sometimes in a compliance situation, people have made up the decision to do what they're doing. It's the people who accidentally in that situation accidentally become dopers that they were trying to protect. And I think that question of is it okay is a really relevant one, just to get people to pause at that point of doing something, because there's something in the back of your head says, I'm not sure this is okay, if you're asking yourself that question, and then it allows you to think, actually I'm going to look into this and see if this is something I either should be doing or if it's a grey area.
Yeah, if it's a grey area as well, it's something, do I need to check? That it's okay to do. So it's absolutely okay to pick up the phone and speak to someone when you're in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the options, as you said, the intelligent questioning, quite often we go for the best and worst, not just, pick the right one out of 4. Because, you do see a lot of badly constructed multiple choice questions where 3 options were never feasible. But sometimes asking people, what's the best thing to do here? And giving them 4 things that on some level might be, 3 of them might be acceptable to do. That sometimes gets them to think a little bit differently as well.
Yeah. And I think it generally tends to avoid the need to put in fairly implausible distractors as well, which can kind of devalue the training. Because people kind of know it's rubbish. That's not going to happen. So it's probably, as you say, a really good way of doing it.
Yeah. So creating something like that, Alan, is one thing. Getting it out to the people who need to access it is another. So maybe on a program level, or even more generally, how would you have any practical tips that an organization could take to promote learning?
Yeah, and just straight on from what you just said, there's the obvious ones, right? So choosing a good LMS or even an LRS, depending on the size of your organization, building teams or working with suppliers who've got really creative people, people who aren't afraid to challenge convention. But ultimately, I think everybody could learn about trying to create a culture that supports learning, really by integrating it, into the fabric of daily operations. So for me, that's about making it easy to access. It's making it easy for people to share and find ways to get them talking about it. So whether that's on your internal social media platforms, if you've got one, or if it's in the office at lunchtime, don't launch something and let it be forgotten. Encourage feedback, encourage people to challenge it. And then that way, the learning that you produce, it never remains, and indeed you as a person, you never remain stagnant, and neither does the organization. So you're able to be agile, review it, update it, keep it current, and really, if you can, avoid that whole sheep dipping. Try and make it personal, make it relevant, and make it memorable. And finally, depending on your organizational size and content matter as well, consider micro learning platforms like Exonify is a really good one. We use it in BT as well. Encourage gamification depending on the level that you're aiming your learning at, and then let your learners challenge each other. There's no other way to kind of really get people engaged with stuff. And as I quite often say to my kids, learning can actually be fun. It doesn't have to be bad.
Absolutely. Well, I think in terms of your LinkedIn profile, I think what stood out to me, Alan, was that you use a phrase that I like to use, where you love learning, but you also love, helping other people to learn, or you love it when other people learn. So I really like that phrase. For someone who maybe is aspiring to be a learning leader, what advice would you give to somebody who wants to develop that reputation?
Well, there's, you've got to be passionate about it, I think. You don't necessarily have to have a plethora of formal qualifications. Passion gets you quite a lot of the way. And, I had aspirations when I was younger to be a teacher. Changed my mind at some point, ended up doing a degree in hospitality management, as you do. I just found my way naturally into L&D, and I've stayed there ever since. So, some of the things that I could share that, the last few years for me, but the first thing, most important thing, it's a very simple thing, which is don't be afraid to take a risk and do something differently. Don't be afraid to, challenge convention. Mentioned that earlier on as well. Don't just, you don't have to just do one thing because you're told to do it. You can look at multiple ways to perform and do something. And you can rely a lot on data as well to help you decide what the best option is for your learners. And all those things, kind of help you develop a reputation, because you're not just sticking to the tried and tested methods. You're really trying to do that something different. And there's one question that, as a learning leader or anybody who's passionate about learning, you should always ask yourself and your stakeholders up front, and that's, what's the problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah.
Because sometimes you can get drawn on a tangent and you end up just doing something for the hell of it. But the best learning interventions and the stuff that people really want to do is when you, as an L&D professional, just ask yourself that very simple question. It's a bit like the "is it okay" question earlier, I suppose, but really get that out of your stakeholders as well. And I touched very briefly as well, didn't I, on data, and don't be afraid of it. It can tell you a lot about, why a particular training need has arisen, and then when you couple that with the problem that you're trying to solve question, it really does help. Yeah. One very final thing, and that is just align yourself with the population as well that will consume your learning. Talk to them, get their ideas, and find out what they want. And if you do that, you'll tend to have a more successful project.
Well, I think that's a great note to finish on, Alan. I think you've given us lots of components there of what learning that works is and what it can be. So thanks a lot for your time today, Alan. We appreciate it.
Very welcome, and I hope I didn't send your listeners into sleep. But
I'm sure they're hanging on every word. So. to the listeners, this is a podcast as part of Aurion Learning Leaders series. You'll be able to access other podcasts and videos on our social channels and also on the Aurion website at www.aurionlearning.com. Thanks.